Good morning and welcome to our second installment of Fireside Chats with our founder. Joining us today is Eric Johnson, Senior Technology Editor at JOC and Director at S&P Global Market Intelligence.
Hey Nick, glad to be joining you today.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure to have you. Our founder and CEO, Shalabh Singhal.
Hi Nick, hi Eric, good to have you here.
Hey Shalabh, great to see you again.
Yep.
Good to see you as always, Shalabh. And moderating today will be myself, Nick Greiff, an Enterprise Account Executive and Team Lead with Trademo. So, the subject for our fireside chat today is what ways does the process of supply chain risk need to evolve to meet current challenges? And we're going to kick things off with the first question to Eric. How would you say supply chain risks are being managed currently?
That's a sweeping question. Well, first of all, I think it helps to break down supply chain into some of its constituent parts. I think first of all, supply chain's taken on it's sort of reached the public consciousness in a way that it really never did pre-pandemic, and it sometimes gets conflated with its individual components. So when I think about supply chain, right, you have kind of the pre-logistics phase, so product development, production, trade compliance type stuff before a product's even made, then production, then into where it turns into freight, and then when it stops being freight at some a point at destination, and then starts to be distributed either direct to a customer or to a store, or if it's a component going to some other production facility at destination. So all of that stuff tends to be lumped into this one term, supply chain. But I mean, we've heard shippers talk about sometimes 80% of their company's staff is technically in supply chain. So it's not just one thing, right? It's all these things. So if you think about how companies are managing it, I think by definition, because it's so broad and it touches so many parts of the company, it's not very well harmonized, right? It's not as harmonized as it could be, right? You don't have every single division that touches supply chain or is involved in supply chain, kind of syncing with each other all the time, right? There tends to be points where they're talking generally when a problem occurs, not proactively, but reactively. So I think that's kind of the big high overarching element that's difficult for companies to overcome is just sort of thinking of these things, thinking of this part of your company that can be, the majority of your employees and the majority of your resources as a single organism is really difficult, right? Because there's just so many individual components, and it by definition gets, kind of segmented and handled individually.
Absolutely. I think, it has become, that catch-all term. And I think, particularly for those that, don't have an intimate knowledge of the industry and all the various components that go into it, think that it is, as you said, one harmonized process. And I think with many companies, they're coming to realize that, with a fractured process and having that, split between departments may not be the most, efficient way to tackle the issue.
Well, and the way things have sort of evolved is each individual part of a company's supply chain or supply chains, have gravitated toward not just processes but different systems, right? So you have a purpose-built system in trade compliance, and a purpose-built transportation management system, and a purpose-built warehousing system, and a fulfillment kind of system, or you may be relying on a third-party provider to sort of handle that or provide you the system. So it's just by the sort of evolution of all these different areas, you're dealing with a lot of different systems, and are they really integrated? Are they connected to each other by a single stream of data? For 99% of companies, no way.
Yeah, I'm sure Shalabh can, certainly relate to the challenges of, integrating multiple data sources across multiple platforms, and having everything, work the way it's supposed to on paper, when it gets rolled out and the rubber meets the road, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's a very good summarization, which Eric just did on dissecting the supply chain and the risk at different stages of the entire material flow, from the raw material to the finished product and to the end distribution. And I think clearly one of the things where most of the organizations lack today is it's very siloed across different team functions, and as Eric mentioned, across different third parties as well. Right, so definitely there is strong lack of harmonization, and that's I would say that's one of the limitations on how supply chain risks are being managed today.
Yeah, I mean, a risk to one part of the organization doesn't necessarily, it may be being dealt with, but it may not translate upstream or downstream, right?
Yeah.
Because of that segmentation. And the systems, right? So that's a hard challenge to overcome, no question.
Yep.
Absolutely. I think if there was, a magic bullet that could solve this all, we wouldn't be in the situation we are today, Yeah. I get the next question, going over to Shalabh, and naturally building off that previous question. How would you say supply chain risks have changed in the current climate, and why does this make the conventional risk management processes somewhat obsolete in the face of these challenges?
Yeah. So Nick, what I believe that supply chain risk have not changed fundamentally. I think the risks have always been there. But what has happened in last few years, especially post-pandemic, that we have seen so many of supply chain shocks so close together that some of these risks, which were not very evident or real to most of the organizations, they have suddenly become much more real, much more bigger than ever before, right? And like if we talk about some of the recent climate changes, the geopolitical events, the cyber attacks that have happened recently, right? These were not perceived as risk or as regular kind of disruptions just few years back, which now I think most of the organizations are realizing are much more real and much more recurrent. It's just a matter of time and place, maybe, that what kind of risk would hit your supply chain, right? And the other, I think, fundamental change in the perception that has happened is that earlier businesses used to believe that they can model risk for next few months or next few quarters or next few years around a particular location, facility, supplier. But now the business environments are changing overnight, right? With any kind of regulation, trade wars, these geopolitical events, more natural disasters or climatic events happening more regularly, that you need some kind of regular stream of data or intelligence to fuel into your supply chain risk management systems to have some kind of relevance, relevant risk monitoring, right? So this is, I think, a fundamental shift where businesses have come to realize that how vulnerable their supply chains have been before, and now somehow all of these risks have hit the supply chains, global supply chains, one after the other. That there's a fundamental change in perception how we look at supply chain risk and how important they are to the overall business resilience. Now, with respect to your second question, that how conventional risk management processes have become obsolete, right? So I think a lot of risk management, first of all, in the past have largely been focused on upstream suppliers, and that too on your immediate suppliers, and just looking at the supply chain relationship management or the supplier performance tracking, right, or supplier audits, right? And most of them were kind of annual audits, and the way data was getting collected also had a strong bias in the system, because the suppliers themselves were asked to kind of furnish this data and to the organizations. So like all the, and definitely it didn't cover all the different kind of risk which we now see impact supply chains, right? So in terms of the amount of or the different kind of risk that we cover, how frequently are we updating our systems, or are we collecting intelligence around some of the upcoming risks, and where this data is coming from. I think all of that collectively, I believe, is now completely obsolete if we have to think about modern supply chain risk management, right? And what we have been doing traditionally, that's just one small piece of what all we need to do to make business resilient.
Yeah, Nick, let me just add something.
Of course.
Great perspective, Shalabh. I think what's interesting, so I spend the bulk of my time covering freight transportation, global freight transportation. And if you step back and think that pre-pandemic, most corporate entities that were, that had global supply chains, the access to space on a container ship was just not a constraint that they ever put into any sort of risk management model, right? It was more of, am I going over budget by 10, 15, maybe 50%, even in a crazy year? But no, I can pay an amount that will get me on a ship to get my product from point A to point B. There were times in 21 where that was not the case, and transit time for shipments went from a normal, say, 60 days to plus 100 days or longer, right? Because you literally, no matter how much you paid, you could not get on a vessel. So shipping essentially went from an always on, always available, always somewhat reliable utility to a premium product that was not a guarantee, right? And so that in and of itself is a new risk. So basically you have a new area to incorporate in a risk model that literally didn't exist before 2021. No one was incorporating a inability to get space on a vessel as a long-term or even short-term risk to worry about, right? So that just shows, to what Shalabh was mentioning, is you can't address things on a quarterly and yearly basis anymore. You have to be sort of almost on a constantly updating your risk model.
Yep. And completely agree to that point, Eric. And I think one of the other things which some of these traditional supply chain risk management systems lack is they really lack in any kind of simulation capability, because with all the different kind of risk which can impact a supply chain, right, we can definitely not predict what's going to happen in the world next day, right? So the overall simulation capability with all these external factors, and then understanding what could actually impact your supply chain, what is your weakest link, that becomes a very important kind of a scenario planning for testing the resilience of your supply chains, right? Which I think is now a kind of a feature or a kind of capability which most of the bigger organizations at least are expecting.
Awesome. Next question goes over to Eric, and naturally building on some of what we have just spoken upon there. In your experience, what would you say are some of the key differences between the traditional approach to supply chain risk management, and how are these going to have to evolve and be enhanced to meet the current challenges?
Well, I think a lot has been written about this, in the last couple of years around, have we changed from a just-in-time sort of model or of supply chains to just in case? And if you think just in time sort of became the de facto traditional model to relate to your question, and did just in case become kind of the new version of that? I sort of think that whether you talk about traditional or current or just in case and just in time, there's sort of false dilemmas in a sense, because nothing in supply chain is binary. You don't wake up and go, "Oh, I need a bunch of buffer inventory to cover my bases so that I don't get caught short next year." You can't just throw buffer inventory. You can't just say, "Well, one sourcing location puts me at too much risk. I need to have 10 now, right? You can't have, there's no company has unlimited resources. So it's really always been about a balance. It's just maybe the balance tilted a little bit more toward diversification, toward having more inventory in transit to sort of mitigate things that do this quicker cadence of disruptions that we've seen over the last few years. So I also think, and I may be wrong on this, but this is my gut feeling a little bit, is we have more data about supply chains than we've ever had before. And sometimes more data means that things feel a little bit crazier than they've felt in years past. It's hard for me to believe that a lot of these things that we see now and that get surfaced really quickly, that some of those things didn't happen before. It's just we now have the capability to like track them and measure them and potentially do something about them. So it feels like these things are happening a lot more often than they are. And then there's the compulsion to want to do something about them. So I think it's also important from a risk management perspective to move away from the traditional, like, what I don't know and what I don't see can't hurt me, to the opposite, which is everything is hurting me, right? Which is not the case, right? I think a new skill to be built into risk management is you have to be able to say, okay, there's a typhoon in North Asia right now. There's a ship blocking a canal. There's, big things happening. And then there's little things happening every day. We need to be able to prioritize what actually matters, and not everything is not a 5-alarm fire, right? So I think that's something that is a new skill that's having to be built as you get more data about what could possibly be going wrong every day.
Yeah, that's a fantastic take on it. I think everyone has this awareness of where their exposures and their weaknesses are, but really kind of digging a little deeper and kind of doing the running the numbers on it and seeing what is the probability of that worst case scenario coming to fruition, and how many resources do we have to devote so that we are covered should the unthinkable come to bear.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Eric said, like with the proliferation of the data, it's also important that we are cutting noise from the signals and just kind of producing relevant insights for the teams, because as Eric rightly said, no organization has unlimited sources, right? And they cannot always be on the fire alarm, right? So just cutting through all the noise and finding out the most relevant insights, I think that's the kind of maturity for a successful supply chain risk management system that they would need.
Excellent. I guess, as we build upon this, next question to Shalabh, what kind of new supply chain risk management software and technology do you think can empower stakeholders through this transition?
Yep. So, Nick, what I believe should be the 3 critical capabilities of a modern supply chain risk management system, in from my perspective. First, obviously, the kind of supplier risk management system that we have been using traditionally, but much more robust, right? So robust in terms of the different kind of risk that this system is able to gather around your particular supplier. A completely different approach of collecting insights around your supplier ecosystem, around your group of suppliers, countries that you're sourcing, which is not just dependent on gathering insights from your immediate suppliers. Definitely, we need to move from more continuous or regular kind of intelligence gathering rather than depending on annual audits and being dependent on our suppliers to kind of get all this information. So continue doing that, but you need many more external data points to corroborate around these, right? And then something which can give you a kind of understanding of risk related to the materials, the location of facilities where these suppliers are located and their companies, right? So not just limited to their financials or their operational risk, but all the other risks which can impact your immediate suppliers, including their facilities, their people, as well as the materials that flow in your supply chain, right? Now, the second capability, I believe, is around the multi-tiered supply chain visibility, or mapping, first of all, your subcontractors, your suppliers somehow, right? And there was a recent survey by McKinsey where they found out that less than 2% of the organizations have any visibility beyond their tier 2 suppliers, right? And ironically, most of the supply chain risk, the upstream supply chain risk, reside with your sub-tier suppliers or your subcontractors, right? So identifying who are my suppliers, being able to at least monitor them with some amount of operational, financial, geopolitical risk on your subcontractors as well is equally important. And that is where a lot of concentration risk is also at times, right? So understanding that piece of the puzzle is very important. And I think the third is a kind of a system which is tracking event risk and which maps with your supply chain, like with a digital twin of your supply chain across the tiers which Eric talked about, right? Like your pre-production phase or production phase, the logistics phase, and then the distribution phase, right? So across these three phases of the supply chain, if you have a digital twin, can you map some kind of event risk management system which is tracking different kind of events, for example, port closures, strikes, right? The weather events, cyber attacks, natural disasters, right? Which we are seeing, or maybe fires in facilities which are impacting the supply chains. Now there are systems in place. You can track media, you can track more event-related websites around these systems. But again, monitoring these events and then understanding their impact on your supply chain so that you can take actions proactively rather than a lot of time, I think that is important. So if at least organization should have 2 of these 3 systems in place. It depends on the maturity of their supply chain risk management program, but ideally I would say that these 3 systems should be put in place to monitor supply chain risk.
Yeah, Nick, maybe just to add really briefly, I think what I sort of see from a demand side is moving from identifying risk, so being aware and monitoring, to quantifying, right? Like that's the need. Is it's not enough to just know that something is happening. They need to know, they need to be able to quantify the impact of that on a global basis, but also on a granular, like sub supply chain basis, right? So that's I think kind of the next step of where this goes.
So to go beyond identification to kind of giving a weighting metric almost to the probability of it coming to bear, and then what the domino effect and the repercussions would be for the rest of the supply chain should that come to pass.
Right.
Yeah. Cool. And as we move on to the next question, this is going out to both of you. We'll kick it off with Eric. Can you think of a few examples where the current supply chain strategy could have been enhanced to mitigate further disruptions?
So I think about this. One of my least favorite phrases that you would see prop up in mainstream media around all the disruptions that happened last year was the supply chain, right? As if all of the world's global multinationals were, you know, on a single supply chain, like it was one highway that everyone was on, basically. So I think of it the opposite, right? Like if you're a large multinational, you have multiple supply chains. You don't just have your own single supply chain. You have, you know, like think of your P&G, and you have a million SKUs and you literally source and deliver to every country in the world, you cannot think of this in a monolithic way. So I think the biggest strategy to help kind of minimize risk is to, we talked earlier on about not being segmented across divisions within supply chain, but I do think from a product or a business unit perspective, you do need to segment that because there's different areas of risk in your business aligned with different products. So if you have a product that is your company highly reliant on, but it's also more vulnerable than a less important but more reliable product, you need to segment that out and do the 80-20 rule on that, right? Like your resources, whether it's tech investment, whether it's people, whether it's just more scrutiny each day, that needs to go to the more, the product that is driving your business that is also, a little bit more, makes you a little bit more vulnerable. So having that ability to segment individual supply chains within your company and then the parts of your supply chain that are also more vulnerable. So like I said before, shipping may not have been vulnerable and it probably won't be vulnerable in 23, right? Where that market is coming back into equilibrium. So you're able to shift, okay, in 21 that I had to focus on that. In 23, I can focus back on kind of like upstream suppliers who maybe they're struggling with a low demand environment right now and they're struggling to even stay in business. So how do you help your partner on the supplier side stay in business? To Shalabh's thing, how do you identify which of those suppliers put you at risk, right, in this key product segment of yours? So it's really about being very tactical about which products make or break your business instead of thinking of one singular supply chain.
Absolutely. Shalabh, I'd love to get your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, so I think in terms of example where like any industry or any company was able to better mitigate some of the supply chain risk, right? I think a recent example which comes to mind is the shortage of semiconductors and the impact it had on the auto industry, right? So as per an estimate, auto companies lost around $200 billion in revenue in 2021 alone, just because of the semiconductor shortage, right? And there's one company which kind of been able to mitigate a lot of this revenue loss or manage it much better than most of the other companies, and that is Toyota, right? And I think Toyota was better prepared for this, and there's some kind of history that I would like to share. So when tsunami hit Japan in 2011, so Toyota supply chain was heavily affected for close to 6 months. And since then, Toyota has been investing a lot in the supply chain risk management. They have been painstakingly identifying their smaller suppliers. They have been building more inventory. So in fact, Toyota is the inventor of the just-in-time model, but I think for last 10-11 years they have been already moving to the just-in-case model. And at least during 2021 they were able to predict these semiconductor shortages in advance, and they already had better inventories, better alternatives to these semiconductors than most of the companies, auto companies globally, especially like US companies were hit very badly, right? And so I think this is one example, and just to understand like why this impacted the industry so much, right? So would like to share some more facts. So I think there are around some 80 million cars or SUVs which are sold per year annually, and each car today has around 1,500 to 3,000 semiconductors, right? But interestingly, there are only around 30 semiconductor fabrication facilities which are not just providing all these semiconductors to these or responsible for kind of fabrication of these semiconductors for all this auto industry, but all the other industries that you can imagine. So just think of the kind of dependency companies have on their on these 30 facilities, and a lot of them are not your first year suppliers, right? So for example, Tesla might be sourcing from Bosch, and Bosch is sourcing from one of these suppliers where Tesla doesn't have any visibility. So most of the organizations, I would say, whether irrespective of how technology advanced they were badly hit because they didn't invest a lot, or they did not foresee all of these risks in this side. And there was this company which had learned from its history and was kind of started investing. And I think that's how this would change in coming years. Now, I think with this pandemic and all these disruptions, many more organizations would have learned their lesson.
Absolutely, and I'm really glad that you chose semiconductors as an example there, because it was also the one that jumped out to me. And I think it's, that example of the perfect storm and this not happening in a vacuum. When we think about semiconductors, that the requirement of the precious and the semi-precious metals to go into it, that so much of the production of these goods is centralized in China and distributed out of China, and then just the huge overarching demand. It was, a perfect storm waiting to happen. And the other product that I think about when I think of the the semiconductor shortage, was Sony's release of the PlayStation 5, and that was supposed to be, one of the hottest commodities or items for the holiday season. And yeah, you just saw the price skyrocket, and Walmart would get a batch of 5,000, and they'd be gone within 30 seconds, a minute of being live on the website.
Yep.
Awesome. And I think that brings us to our last question. I'll put this over to you, Eric, to start. What advice would you give to organizations that are trying to meet and address these challenges? And how do you think a supply chain risk management software can be leveraged as part of a modern risk management solution?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think in general, risk management was sort of, you could lump it into sort of that bucket with ESG or, sustainability type considerations where, it was sort of on the charter for most companies, but it always lagged budget, service, the traditional kind of metrics that companies use to gauge their supply chains. So I think, making risk management a metric that is more equivalent to the traditional ones is a good start from a vision or process perspective. Easier said than done, for sure. It's really hard it's hard enough to judge things along 2 dimensions. Now you have, maybe 3, 4, 5. I'm probably forgetting one. Labor availability would be probably another one, right? You need people with new sets of skills that they didn't have before, that you didn't necessarily have before. But so making it another one of these dimensions that you truly judge your supply chain by, I think is a start. In terms of incorporating technology, most companies have a decision to make, and this goes along with what I had mentioned before about being able to segment different parts of your supply chain. How much do you feel you can handle in-house? So that means, kind of gravitating toward a solution that helps you, understand the risks and contextualize them. And how much do you think you don't have that capability or that resource and you really need to hand it off to a third party, right? Whether it's a company that purely handles kind of risk management, or is it part of your 3PL type relationship, and that's just something that they help you manage. It may be a product by product decision, right? There's certain products that you need to own the risk management of, and there's others that are, further downstream on your priority tree, that further down on the priority tree, that you can say, I'm okay with my 3PL handling kind of risk evaluations on this, because it's just a better cost equation, right, in total. So I think the first thing is increase the priority of risk management And secondly is make decisions on a granular basis about what can be handled in-house and what can be outsourced.
Interesting.
Very wise words, I think, there. And with that, we'll give the final word over to Shalabh.
Yeah, so I think first of all, I would echo with what Eric said, right? And I believe that I think supply chain risk management is a journey, right? So if the organization has not invested a lot in last couple of years as a complete organization in terms of the organization alignment of people focusing on the supply chain risk management or putting systems in place, integrating their different kind of flow of the data around supply chains, right? So that all requires an investment and time resources. So it's a journey where organizations need to assess how vulnerable their supply chains are, how much disruptions have been caused or to their industry, to their competition or to themselves, and then accordingly kind of allocate the budget. And I think it needs to be kind of a more organizational wide function. So it can't be just a single team handling the supply chain risk management. And I think businesses also need to think of it as a more strategic function rather than a cost function. I would maybe go to an extreme and say that think of it as defense, like the countries think about their defense, right? So they're not always fighting, but they always continue to have a budget and doing training, forecasting, having intelligence for their defense function. I think for organizations, and especially who have more complex global kind of supply chains, to thrive in today's world, which I think for some reason has become much more vulnerable due to the geopolitical risk as well as all the climatic risk that we are seeing today. I think this is much more important than ever. And the other change is that consumers are becoming much more demanding and they want to know where the goods are being sourced from. So it also has a kind of brand reputational risk if if organizations do not really understand their supply chains well. So with I think that perspective in mind, making it an organizational wide function, continuously investing in it, building a kind of a plan for long term, and just measuring their metrics around those goals. I think that is what is critical.
Absolutely. And I think on that note, that concludes our second installment of Fireside Chats with our founder. We'd like to thank Eric for his participation today and the invaluable insights that he has provided.
Thanks so much for having me, Nick.
Of course, anytime. If you or your organization have been affected by any of the issues raised in today's Fireside Chat or are looking for a trusted partner to assist with highly granular transactional trade data or compliance, sanctions, and landed cost, please feel free to reach out to us via one of the links below and we'll be more than happy to assist. Goodbye for now and stay tuned for our next installment.